They were sent with a sergeant to make up the numbers at this demonstration outside the Libyan embassy in St James's Square. When, as we know, at 10:15 that morning, a gunman leaned out of the first floor window. In fact, there were two gunmen leaned out of the first floor window and fired Sterling submachine guns on fully automatic at the crowd. This was the first time, in fact it remains the only time, such a thing has ever happened on the UK mainland. We describe it as one of the greatest tragedies in UK policing history. It's the only time that the murder of a police officer has been recorded live on TV, with the BBC cameras rolling, recording actually as it was happening.
Good evening, Crime Timing. Tom Wood, how are you this evening?
Very well, Simon. Very well indeed. Nice to speak to you.
Like me, you'll be looking forward to this because tonight we have a special guest with us, a far-travelled guest, Matt Johnson from down south. Are you in Wales, Matt? Is that right?
Yeah, I'm in South Wales, and thanks for inviting me on this evening.
Not at all. Pleasure to have you. Matt, this is a fantastic subject that we're going to cover tonight, and it's an in-depth subject too because of the length of time that's passed. And I think it gives every copper a wee glow when we work on old cases and come to some satisfaction at the end of it. Matt, can you lay the foundation here? Tell us a wee bit about yourself. With a name like Johnson, are you Scottish, really?
Grandfather Gavin from south of Scotland somewhere, emigrated to South Wales to work in the mines, married a Welsh lady and produced my mother, and my mother moved to London, met my father, and I was born and brought up in London.
There's some hope for you, really.
Yeah, I think so. I joined the Met in 78. In the first instance, if I take you back to 1984. In 1984, I was a PC working in central London. I was working on a police traffic car by the call sign Oscar Echo 15, which was based out of a traffic base in Euston in central London. And our job was to deal with traffic congestion in central London, serious road traffic accidents, ambulance escorts, that kind of thing. And on the 17th of April, I was on early turn, and I was sent as a result of an emergency call to go to Regent Street to pick up an ambulance escort to take an ambulance on the hurry up to Westminster Hospital. And I knew no more than that about the fact that's what I was doing on this particular day. We found the ambulance at the end of Charles II Street, dropped in front of them, they slotted in behind us. We escorted them at high speed through the back streets of London because my operator at the time knew the back streets quite well, and we managed to find them some shortcuts, get them to Westminster Hospital quite quickly. Left the ambulance there, having done our job, and returned to central London, where there had been, we were aware by this time, some form of major incident in St James's Square where a demonstration was taking place. During the course of the day, we were pretty busily employed trying to deal with the traffic problems, but rumours started to filter through that a WPC had been shot. Rumours also filtered through that an inspector had been shot, although that proved to be unfounded. And then later on that this WPC had died. There wasn't a name released, we didn't know who it was. And at that evening I went home, got home just before the 6 o'clock news came on, and I was living in a new house in East London with my girlfriend of the time. And the 6 o'clock news came on, and a picture of Yvonne Fletcher came up on the 6 o'clock news. Now, that was a stunning and pretty horrible moment in our household, because just a few weeks prior to that day, Yvonne had been at our housewarming party. So we only very recently moved in. So I had no idea until that moment that the ambulance escort I'd done that morning had been my own friend that I was taking to hospital. In that ambulance with Yvonne was a PC called John Murray. John was Yvonne's working partner, and they were home beat officers together, community officers together, and they were scheduled that day to do pretty routine work, and they were retasked to go to this demonstration. They were sent with a sergeant to make up the numbers at this demonstration outside the Libyan embassy in St James's Square. When, as we know, at 10:15 that morning, a gunman leaned out of the first floor window. In fact, there were two gunmen leaned out of the first floor window and fired Sterling submachine guns on fully automatic at the crowd. This was the first time, in fact, it remains the only time such a thing has ever happened on the UK mainland. We describe it as one of the greatest tragedies in UK policing history. It's the only time that the murder of a police officer has been recorded live on TV, with the BBC cameras rolling, recording actually as it was happening.
On the podcast, on here, Matt, at the end of the podcast, and remind me to do this tonight, we often ask our guests to think about something that was defining for them, something that maybe set the track for their career, or put them on the track, or made them think, this is the job for me, something along those lines. What you've just described, and I'm going to ask you to go back over it again a wee bit, because there'll be lots of listeners here that this is news to, that maybe didn't know about the murder of Yvonne Fletcher because of the passage of time. But I would suggest that every serving officer at the time, in fact, most people in the country, whether police officers or not, were affected by the murder of Yvonne Fletcher that day. And it's one of those instances that people remember where they were, that kind of thing. And also, can you tell us a wee bit about Yvonne then? Because we never get behind that, do we? We never get to learn about the person. And she's the person here that we'd like to know about.
Yvonne Fletcher was only 25 years old on the day she was killed. And she was unusual because she was the shortest female officer in the whole of the Met. And because of her stature, she would turn people's heads because they would think how tiny she was.
Yeah.
When she did her interviews to join the Met, she had failed to get into Wiltshire Police. And she'd applied to the Met because there were rumours that for some reason the Met takes anybody. Not true, of course. But for some obscure reason, she figured she had a better chance. But she did her interview at Paddington, and her inspector in charge of the panel wrote on the interview notes that what she lacked in stature, she more than made up for in personality. And so they offered her a place. She did her training and she was posted out to Bow Street Police Station, which is where she worked for subsequent years. She was a real hard worker, a grafter. She was absolutely known for her incredibly sharp sense of humour. I met her, for example, when I was doing a heavy load escort, where traffic patrol motorcyclists used to escort heavy loads through London. And we were doing this convoy, this escort convoy one day. And in those days, I think it's probably still the case now, traffic officers were known as black rats. We did this escort into the early hours, absolutely soaking wet. And we decided that before we headed back to our traffic unit in the East End of London, we were going to call in at Bow Street Canteen for a late cup of tea to try and warm up. And as we walked in, there was Yvonne Fletcher there. And we walked in and she said, drowned rats, which was so typical of her. Very sharp, very witty, brilliant, lovely smile. She was known at Bow Street as Super Fletch because of that personality, because she was so hardworking. She used to teach young recruits the ropes on what we called street duties courses when they first came out to the police station. And she was known as a mentor and a guide. And of course, lots of young PCs and WPCs went through her hands. And of course, she was very well known because of that.
Because of her stature and because of that position. Tom, the thing I remember quite vividly, I don't actually remember the details of it, but it was about the hat, the policewoman's hat sitting on top of the casket. You remember that, Tom?
I remember the incident very distinctly, and as you said, Matt, I think you're absolutely right. It was a seminal moment in policing throughout the UK. And the first thought was, I remember distinctly, as I was thinking, this could have been one of us, because we, that period of time in the 80s, there was a lot of public order stuff. There was the miners' strike and all the rest going on. So we were quite often deployed on public order duties. And here was Yvonne Fletcher, who was just simply making up a cordon and was gunned down indiscriminately. And the other thing that struck us was that we literally couldn't believe that the Metropolitan Police didn't close down that locus and make sure that they got the culprit as they came out. And watching I remember the police hat lying in the middle of the road, but I also remember the culprits coming out, rank and file, out being led out of the embassy. And we thought, hang on a minute, there's got to be something else happening here. Then we thought, I remember the discussion was, now there'll have been a deal struck, and the person who's responsible will be surrendered. Because it was inconceivable to us that a police officer be gunned down in the streets of the UK and that the culprit be allowed to walk away. Remember that just a few years before, we'd had the Iranian embassy siege, where special forces had stormed the place. We'd had Spaghetti House before that. And there was this doctrine that if you did something like that in the UK, then you did not get away with it. You did not get away with it. That was the bottom line. And so we thought for some time after, we thought, no, there's going to be a political deal and the culprit from this will be surrendered. He will appear in police custody. And you'll hear about him appearing at Bow Street Magistrates Court. There will have been a deal because the British government and the Metropolitan Police will not have allowed somebody to get away with murdering a police officer on the streets of London. It just won't happen. And of course it did. You're absolutely right, Matt, when you said it's one of the most awful incidents in the history of modern policing, going back to the 1800s. I really do. I'm fascinated by the story. I still remember it very well. And I'm looking forward to hearing the details and hearing what happened.
The story is incredibly complicated.
Let's go back just a wee bit there, Matt. You see how lucky we are to have Tom, who goes back to the 1800s with his policing.
But the thing is, what Tom says there about the effect that the shooting had us on the day is exactly right. The shock waves were felt throughout the whole of the United Kingdom Police Service on that particular day.
Matt, can you tell us a wee bit about Yvonne's background and her family?
She was from Semley in Wiltshire. I think she was 18, 19 when she joined the Met, so she had about 6 years service on the day she was killed. She was a uniformed officer for her entire career, although she did specialise in a particular problem that Central London has, and she worked on what was called the Tom Squad, Tom being a colloquial term for prostitutes. And she used to work in plain clothes and in uniform on that squad, and that is how I got to know her, because my first wife was on the same squad. So all the girls were very pally, they were a very close-knit working group. And that's how come Yvonne was at my housewarming party, because my first wife was a good friend of hers.
It's very interesting that she was refused entry in her stature. She didn't come across as she was liable to be a police officer. In those days, especially when we had height restrictions and whatnot in place, it says a lot about her just knowing that she was determined to become a police officer and went and applied to the Met as well. Thankfully, they gave her a chance, because it sounds like she would have been a wonderful police officer moving forward.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I've no doubt she would.
Tom said that we couldn't believe, every copper in the country, probably every person in the country, thought that the embassy would be closed and these guys would be marched away in handcuffs, etc., because it was so obvious what had happened. And you said that it was all recorded by the BBC, the cameras were there was a demonstration. Just before that, was there other people injured as well? Because this was a kind of random machine gunning.
There were a large number of rounds fired at the crowd outside. 12 Libyan demonstrators were badly injured, some of them very badly, but Yvonne was the only fatality.
And the demonstration, can you tell us a bit about the demonstration? This was planned. There was a lot going on in Libya at the time, wasn't there?
It was all organised by an organisation called the National Front for the Salvation of Libya. And the National Front, NFSL, they represented expatriate Libyans who were living in Europe. A lot of them were in the UK. And these were people who were opposed to the Gaddafi regime. And what was going on in 1983 is that Gaddafi was sending people from his revolutionary committees throughout Europe to target people who were against his regime. And when I say target, I mean kill. There were bombings and there were shootings in Europe, in Manchester, in London. There was a shooting outside the London Mosque. There was a bombing in Manchester. There were bombings and unexploded devices in London. in late 1983, early 1984. So there was this campaign going. And then in April of 1984, two very popular students who were members of the NFSL were hanged in Tripoli. People who were against Gaddafi, in response to something like that, would converge on London to voice their anger at what Colonel Gaddafi was up to and the way he was persecuting and disappearing people.
Like we're seeing just now with the Palestinian problem, we've got demonstrations all over the UK with people protesting primarily about the Israelis' reaction to the terrorist events and whatnot. Tom, can I put you on the spot here? Because you said you couldn't believe, none of us could believe what was going on in the Met.
Yeah.
What if that had happened at an Edinburgh consulate, of which there are plenty? What if that had happened in the centre of Edinburgh and you had been in your role as deputy chief or divisional commander at the time, whatever you chose to be? What would the Scottish police have reacted like, do you think?
We'd have taken direction from the Crown Office, our prosecution service. In the first instance, we'd have closed down and contained the scene and would not have let anybody come out. And I'm intrigued to hear from Matt exactly what happens legally and politically to allow the subsequent disaster. Because the thing is, it's not as if the Met didn't have plenty of experience in this. They had the most experience in this. They did a fantastic job at the Iranian embassy and all the other things. Remember, that was the era of the IRA things, and you had the Spaghetti House and you had Balcombe Street, all of that. So they had a huge experience.
Heathrow Airport as well.
Absolutely. The first thing we would do is contain the scene and not let people walk away. But clearly there were bigger machinations.
Matt, can you tell us then, without what we now know, 40 years down the road, and thanks to people like yourself and John Murray in particular, what we've learned over the years, if we can put that aside just now, what was the reaction by the police on the day? What was the reaction of the local commanders and the prosecution service? Were the security services all over this? This is what it's starting to sound like to me.
Initially, the reaction was one of being quite dumbfounded. The officers actually in the street, many of them thought a firecracker had been thrown. A lot of them didn't recognize what had happened as gunfire. It was only as the seconds rolled by that they started to see the wounds and the evidence of multiple injuries to lots of people, that they began to realize that they'd been fired upon, and they were standing there in full view of the windows where the shooting had come from and in danger of being shot at again. Many of them thought that it was simply a case that the gunmen were reloading and were about to open fire for the second time. And so they had an awful situation there of thinking, we need to evacuate these people, these injured, get them to safety, get them to cover, including Yvonne, of course, who was lying there right in front of the windows. And so, to their absolute credit, they didn't panic. There were two senior officers, a chief inspector, superintendent rather, and an inspector called Alex Fish, who went on to eventually become a chief superintendent. And Alex really got a grip of the young men and women that he was in charge of, and there wasn't a second lot of firing. But they weren't to know that wasn't going to happen, and they were very vulnerable. And then in the immediate aftermath of that, as the evacuation took place, the Met's diplomatic protection group were in the area. And so there was an armed police motorcyclist who was actually in the square at the time. So he got behind a vehicle and pointed his Smith & Wesson pistol at the front windows for all the good that was going to do. And then other diplomatic protection group officers surrounded the embassy to stop any immediate escape. But what those officers didn't know was there was another exit out of the back of the embassy through some underground garages into a street called Bab Mays Street. And Bab Mays Street provided the actual gunman with the opportunity to effect an escape. So although the premises were surrounded at the front, literally within seconds, it took a couple of minutes before sufficient officers were deployed to get around the back of the premises. In that period, the actual gunman slipped away. So but by the time the embassy was sealed off, there were 40 men trapped inside the embassy.
So it was only the gunman that they got away sharpish into the car.
The gunman and two gunmen and two drivers. They had escape cars waiting. So literally, they fired the guns, ran through the embassy, straight into the cars and away.
So that sounds premeditated. That wasn't a random,
Absolutely.
spontaneous thing. Yeah.
Not only that, the actual demonstration that was happening outside was unusual because there had been several previous demonstrations, and what would happen is the anti-Gaddafi demonstrators would congregate on the opposite side of the road, opposite the street, and voice their dissent towards Gaddafi. And then the Gaddafi supporters would stand on the footway immediately outside the embassy, voicing their anger at the anti-Gaddafi supporters. On this one day, instead of standing immediately outside the embassy, these pro-Gaddafi supporters, numbering about 25 or 30, stood in two groups to the side, out of the line of fire. As soon as the shooting took place, they were gone instantly. So everybody on the police side and from the anti-Gaddafi supporters and from the press and the public who were there, everybody who was around the front who was heard what sounded like a firecracker going on and had absolutely no concept that they'd actually been fired at with machine guns, the pro-Gaddafi people knew the moment the firing took place, they were away, disappeared.
Tom, can I bring you in there? Because Tom has a lot of expertise. He was a gold commander with crowd control. Have you got any observations about that, Tom, about how to police these events?
I'm actually learning things here because I didn't realise that the gunmen slipped away in the first few minutes. I didn't know that. I thought the suspicion was that the gunmen were contained and that the actual suspects walked out of the embassy. I'm learning something about this and it's fascinating.
What I would add to that is although the gunmen escaped, the conspirators, the people involved in the planning, the preparation, the sourcing of the weapons, other people were still inside. They were still there. We know the rules of collective responsibility in terms of committing a crime. It's not just the trigger men who are responsible for the killing. Everybody who's involved in that planning and execution of that plan is as guilty as the people who's actually pulled the trigger. And many of those were still inside the Bureau. And for the next 2 weeks, the Bureau was surrounded.
Running behind this, then, is the suggestion that this was Gaddafi wanting to send a powerful message. One of the many acts that he carried out before Tripoli was raided by the Americans. Do you think this was a completely deliberate act to send a message to these counter demonstrators?
If you like, because the result of the investigation that we've done over several years, we now know what was going on. At the time, it was an absolute mystery. We didn't know who was responsible. We didn't know why the UK government had allowed all the people that were involved to be deported rather than arrested and prosecuted. We didn't know, as young officers ourselves, why our organisation, the Metropolitan Police, had allowed these people to go.
Let's look at that then, Matt, because we haven't talked about that. So on the day it's closed down, you said nobody came out of there for 2 weeks. You had it locked down. You knew where the back door was within 5 or 10 minutes when everybody had a chance to get their act together. And there was still 40 embassy staff and et cetera, all male, contained within there. And I take it we got the gun from there as well.
No, the guns weren't recovered. The actual machine guns, the Sterling machine guns, went with the gunmen.
Okay, so we've got this 2 weeks now. Now, somebody said there that the British government allowed them to go. How did that come about? Did we know that was happening? Were they all taken away in a bus, or how did that come about?
A lot of negotiations were going on between the people who were trapped inside the embassy and the hostage negotiators who were based in a building just around the corner from the embassy. So you had the Met's hostage negotiation team trying to negotiate a surrender, a peaceful surrender.
Yep.
But very quickly, that the Met realised that the amount of firepower that had been used during the course of this attack, the Diplomatic Protection Group, which were effectively our armed response, did not have the capacity to resist an armed breakout by the men inside the embassy. The hostage negotiators And the Gold Commander at the time realised that if they come out shooting, we cannot stop them. And so the Met officers were actually briefed to not engage the gunmen in a street fight with firearms because they would be very quickly overwhelmed and killed. And so what happened was that the Special Air Service were called in, and the initial brief to the Special Air Service was to provide a countermeasure to deal with a breakout from the embassy. So rather than like with the Iranian embassy in 1980, where the brief was to go in and rescue hostages, in this particular case there were no hostages, but what you had was believed to be a large group of heavily armed men inside the embassy who might be prepared to break out. So the SAS's job on the day, effectively, was to provide that armed containment that at the time the police weren't capable of doing.
Okay. Before we move on, going back to Yvonne, I don't think she was shot directly. Matt, was she? Was it a ricochet?
She was shot directly. There was a bullet fired from a first floor window. The forensic people who did the subsequent analysis worked out that it was a bullet that came from one of the first floor windows. It went in through her right shoulder, just below her right shoulder blade, went through her abdomen, out through her left side of her torso, and passed through her left elbow. So it literally went straight through her, out the other side. And it was actually, the bullet was actually found in the ambulance, because when she was taken to hospital, it actually fell from the sleeve of her tunic onto the bed where she was laying in the ambulance.
Was she dead on arrival, Matt, when she got to the hospital?
I'm sure John Murray will tell you a lot more about this, because obviously he was there with her. But she was alive, and at the time there was every hope that she was going to survive. But an hour later, she died on the operating table.
So, Matt, take us forward from that day then, if you will, to what's going on behind the scenes, if you like, because the Met's job's quite straightforward, wanting to get their hands on these guys in the embassy, especially the shooter and any conspirators. So what's going on behind the scenes at the time? As far as we know at the time, does nobody know?
Yes, we do now. Thanks to the 20-year and 30-year rule, a lot of documentation, reports, records kept at the time have all been disclosed now. Information that we would never have been entitled, would never have the opportunity to see in the immediate aftermath, is now starting to become available. And under the 30-year rule in 2014, a lot of material became available from 1984. Now, we've been on to the National Archives, and we've sent a large number of Freedom of Information requests to the Home Office and the Foreign Office, and gradually we've been able to draw together the picture of what was really going on in 1983 and 1984. And there was a lot of friction. There was a lot of friction because, as you say, the Met wanted the people responsible arrested and prosecuted. But literally within 24 hours, and this was amazing when we first read this, within 24 hours, the UK Foreign Office was telling UK embassies around the world that the Libyans inside the embassy were going to be released on the grounds of diplomatic immunity. Within 24 hours of the shooting happened, the government had made that decision. Now, to the press, to the media, a very different picture was being portrayed, where the government were very supportive of the police action, that this kind of thing mustn't happen and everybody must be called to account. But behind the scenes, very different things were going on.
Tom, you're a young policeman back then. Tell us the political climate as you remember it in the 80s. I'm obviously far too young to remember what was going on, but I know that you will.
You mean you're far too old to remember now? The 70s and the 80s were times of great turmoil and public unrest, but I'm intrigued by this because clearly the implication is that the British government did not want to offend Gaddafi. And there must have been some reason why, some overwhelming reason, because even the Foreign and Commonwealth Office at their most perfidious, shall I say, to somehow impede or to gloss over the murder of a police officer, an unarmed police officer in the streets of Britain, is absolutely remarkable.
I've been fascinated to hear the rest of the story.
And just why this extraordinary move was made.
Tom, you clearly think like a detective. The ABC of detective work: accept nothing, believe nobody, challenge everything.
That's it.
Hey,
That's it.
You're a traffic cop. Who taught you that? You've been reading a book. You've been hanging about with the wrong kind of people, Matt. I think that's the answer.
My only stint in traffic was as a PC. After that, when I was a sergeant, I was in plain clothes as a sergeant.
Ah, that's all right then. But there's one thing that's bugging me at the time, and knowing with the Met, I worked with the Met about a decade after that, and there was a real intelligence, or was there a real intelligence breakdown here? Because I would expect us to have been all over this before the demonstration. I would have expected us to know that there was weapons involved, because it was obviously premeditated. You don't turn up with a stealth machine gun on the day and just perchance have some ammunition lying about. I think there's a failure there if we didn't know something was going down.
Let me take you back to 1983. 1983, the Conservative government has swept in the power on the back of the Falklands War, where the Conservative government made a lot of decisions during the course of the Falklands, which made them very popular. And in 1983, Maggie Thatcher and the Conservative government swept back into a power wave of popularity in the aftermath of the Falklands War.
Yep.
Prior to this time, Margaret Thatcher and the leaders in the Conservative government at the time had, and not uniquely, because it wasn't unique to them, all the governments of both political persuasions were very much of a mind that they needed to defeat the power of the National Union of Mine Workers. And they'd done various things in the 1970s and 1980s, and every single time the government, whether it be Labour or Conservative, went head to head with the National Union of Mine Workers, the miners would win. And they would win because essentially they held the power to decide whether the power stations kept running or not, because the bulk of UK power was produced by coal. In the run-up to 1983, Margaret Thatcher had briefed a couple of her ministers to come up with a plan to defeat the National Union of Mine Workers. And that plan not only involved economical sanctions to the miners and things like that to freeze their assets and things like that, but it involved the build-up of large resources of coal so that the power stations could keep running, so that the UK resources of coal would outlast the miners, and eventually the miners would be, to use Margaret Thatcher's words, brought to their knees. But what happened is in late 1983, the National Union of Mine Workers, under the leadership of Arthur Scargill, got wind of this build-up of coal reserves. And so they introduced a work to rule so that the reserves couldn't be built up. And the government realised that they were going to lose this forthcoming 1984 miners' strike again. They were going to lose again. And so they realised they needed a plan B. And the plan B that they had come up with involved the amount of power that UK oil-fired generators were able to produce. Now, the UK didn't have enough oil reserves to keep those oil-fired generations going, and so they needed a supply of oil. And it just so happened that in 1983, Libya was the subject of UN and United States sanctions, meaning that they were unable to sell their oil. So they had a glut of oil going cheap that they were unable to sell. So what happened was a deal was done between the UK Secret Intelligence Service and the Libyan External Security Organization, their equivalent of MI6, to enable the UK to buy Libyan oil in breach of sanctions and on the cheap. And in 1983, lots and lots of oil was beginning to be imported into the UK, ready for the miners' strike that they knew was inevitably going to take place in early 1984, because they knew that in March 1984 they were going to start closing mines. They knew that would trigger a strike. It was all part of a plan. Take it over to the Libyan side. The Libyans, Colonel Gaddafi at their head, realized that they had this nice, cozy deal, secret deal, going with the UK government. And in a way, this gave them a license, an opportunity to attack the anti-Gaddafi members and people from the National Front for the Salvation of Libya and other similar organizations who had moved to Libya and were operating from within the United Kingdom. And so Gaddafi sent over several small teams of assassins, and these were the people that were responsible for the Manchester bombings and the London bombings and the shooting outside the Regent's Park Mosque. On the 17th of April 1984, there was due to be a demonstration taking place outside at the Bureau. But this was no ordinary demonstration, because what had happened was Gaddafi was unhappy about the progress that these assassination teams, they were called his revolutionary committees, and he wanted them to up their gambit a bit. And so one of them, a chap called Salih Ibrahim Mabrouk, was recalled to Libya, and he had a meeting with Gaddafi, and Gaddafi briefed him and said, look, you've got to do this. You've got to come up with a plan. And they came up with a plan to lure their targets to London, because they realized that if they did something in Tripoli which antagonized the anti-Gaddafi people in the UK, that those people would demonstrate outside the embassy. They would put all their disguises on so they didn't get recognized and that their families and friends and what have you suffer as a result, but they would descend upon London to demonstrate. Now, they had three particular targets. One of them was the secretary of the National Front for the Salvation of Libya, and the two other targets were two particular brothers. And what they wanted to do was they wanted to lure these three men as part of the demonstrators to London. Then on the day, the plan was that they were going to send snatch teams out of the Libyan embassy into the crowd to grab their targets, whisk them into the embassy, straight through the back, into waiting cars, and away before the police could react.
Just before you tell us how that plan had to be adapted on the day, you're talking as if this is absolute 100% fact. Do we now know this? Is this from the records that you've uncovered, you and
Yes,
John Murray have uncovered?
Yeah. That's right. What happened is because John has campaigned over the last 35, 40 years, when Colonel Gaddafi was killed and a lot of the threat to people who knew things was removed, people started to come forward, because thanks to John's campaigning, people were aware that this was still a relevant and an issue that the police were interested in dealing with. And so people who knew what the plan was, people knew who was responsible, people who could name names started to come forward and do just that. And so that is how the Met and eventually us we began to learn what these actual plans were.
Tom,
Do you actually have a record of the fact that the UK broke the oil sanctions with Libya? Is that factual?
It's factual in as much as it's evidence given by individuals who knew what was going on.
Okay, because you see, I was heavily involved in the miners' strike here in Scotland, and my observations of it don't quite chime with yours in that there were enormous coal stocks. And the real problem for the miners from the get-go was that, I think very cleverly, the Conservative government decoyed them out and they started the strike in the middle of the summer, when, of course, there was less need for coal than during the winter. But there were enormous coal stocks, certainly in the Scottish coal fields during the 84, 85. I don't argue at all with your theory about after 72, after the miners' strike in 72 and the fall of the Heath government, there was certainly a determination that eventually the government would have to confront the miners' union as a sort of a symbol of the whole of the union movement. I don't question that. That's well known as a political fact. But the business about the coal stocks doesn't chime with what I certainly know was happening in Scotland. So that's what I'm interested in.
What I would also say is, thanks to the disclosures we managed to obtain through the National Archives, we actually have records of cabinet meetings where this plan was discussed. And we actually have the names. I name them in the book because we actually have the names of the ministers who were tasked with and who drew up the plans to do this.
Matt, I was going to say to you, you hadn't mentioned the book. It's not been mentioned here tonight because your book came out about 6 months ago, didn't it? What's it called?
It's called No Ordinary Day. No Ordinary Day, The Truth Behind the Murder of WPC Yvonne Fletcher.
And who published it?
Adlib, the publishers.
Okay, and it's available on the usual outlets and Amazon and all.
Yeah, usual outlets. Yeah.
Yep. Tell us the name again.
No Ordinary Day.
In the book, where do you start and where do you end in the book? Because we're not at the end of this story yet. This story's just about to get legs and arms again as we approach the anniversary. So where does the book take us to? How far does it? And it's all evidenced.
Yeah, it's all evidenced. I've got I've got piles and piles of papers, which it took me months going through with a highlighter pen, picking out incredible details of conversations between Margaret Thatcher and Leon Britton, for example, and Leon Britton and Sir Geoffrey Howe, and memos sent by Sir Geoffrey Howe to his embassies, and then records of telex conversations between the Libyan ambassador in Tripoli and the Foreign Office in London. It was absolutely stunning what we were reading, an incredible revelation. But to go back to the shooting, when on the day when the superintendent in charge of the operation decided that in order to keep the opposing parties separated, that he was going to put metal barriers up outside the embassy and metal barriers on the opposite side of the road. So it meant that these snatch teams that they'd intended would run across the road, grab their targets and whisk them away to waiting cars around the back of the embassy. They couldn't do it. They desperately tried to get the barriers removed, and as a result of which, two of the key conspirators were arrested. Obstructing police, literally. But it meant that those remaining people inside the embassy who were part of the plan to grab their targets were in a state of panic because they knew that Gaddafi would be expecting them to at least grab or kill their target. So they decided, and that night there was an incredible amount of communication took place between the Libyan embassy and Tripoli, and that communication was monitored by GCHQ at Cheltenham. There's an industrial dispute going on at the time because the civil servants working in GCHQ are in dispute over their pay and terms and conditions with the UK government, who want to ban unions within GCHQ. And so they got a work to rule going. They are therefore not doing their night shifts properly. So all this communication traffic between the Libyan embassy and Tripoli, although it's being monitored, it's not being fed through to the decision makers and do something about it. And it doesn't get fed through until the morning. A chap called Mike Arnold is the communications officer on duty. He gets hold of the telexes, the translated telexes, realizes an attack is imminent, and attempts to warn the Met about what's happening. But he's literally minutes too late. Literally minutes too late.
So part of the problem is that Gaddafi's team have lured the leaders of the resistance, if you like, or his critics, to St James Square, and this is a big chance to get them out of there, and they were thwarted by the barriers.
So what they did, their plan B was to shoot at their targets instead of snatching them from the crowd. So they leaned out the windows, thought they'd identified their targets within the crowd, fired the machine guns at them in an attempt to kill their intended targets, and poor Yvonne was in the way.
Tom, we could go on all night with this, but we're going to get an interview with John Murray soon, who was in the ambulance with Yvonne that day. And did he make some kind of pledge at that time? He's kept it going for 40 years.
He's an absolutely remarkable man. He's from Aberdeen. He travelled to London, joined the Met Cadet Corps in the early 1970s, worked his way through the cadets, worked it through training. He was a bit older than Yvonne at the time. And as I previously mentioned, he was working with her as a partner on this community policing team that they were on. They were working partners together. So they were great friends. They'd been pals for a long time. They socialized together. They knew each other very well. And on the day that she was shot, John went in the ambulance with her to hospital. And in the back of the ambulance, when he was talking to her, she realized that she'd been badly hurt, but she didn't realize how badly hurt she was. And they discussed it, and he promised her that he would not rest until he had got the people responsible for injuring her. As it turned out, the people responsible for killing her. And he, having made that promise has dominated the entirety of his life ever since. And he has not rested. He has done things, he has left no stone unturned. He has travelled to Libya, risked his life, had people attempt to kill him. He has done things, I think, that many of us, and I include myself in this, risks I would not take. And he has achieved things that official investigations weren't able to achieve. And I'll give you a simple example of the kind of thing that John could do that the Met couldn't do. The Met in the 2000s sent over a team at the invitation of the Libyans to Tripoli to interview witnesses. Witnesses were held in a prison in Tripoli. And when the Met team went to the prison to interview, they were denied access. They wouldn't let them in. And so there the police investigation ended and they were back on the plane and they flew home. When John got to hear about this, he followed them and he went over privately and he went to the prison and he asked the prison guard how much to get in. Something that he could do, which no official police investigation could do. And he bribed his way in. And he got in and he got to see the key people. And he established contacts that official channels couldn't achieve because he was dealing with a people that what we would call a bribe was to them was part of a normal culture, a normal service to be to do. Whilst we would never countenance paying for information, paying to access a witness, he could do it.
Really looking forward to hearing his side of it.
One day he actually found himself sitting in a building talking to the man who pulled the trigger.
It's fascinating, and I've thoroughly enjoyed this. And there's so many resonances here because at the moment, of course, it's 35 years ago yesterday since Pan Am 103 fell to Lockerbie. And many of us were involved in that whole thing and have been involved in it going forward. And of course, the big question there is the Libyan connection and their subterfuge. And were they acting on behalf of Iran or was it Iran? And what part did people play? And there's still very much an active investigation. In fact, last night on television, I saw our Lord Advocate, who is our chief prosecutor in Scotland, talking about a man who is presently in custody in America and who is scheduled to appear in court. There's a court date set for the middle of 2025. So, and the point she was making is that there is no expiry date on this kind of crime. And I'm absolutely delighted, and I can't wait to meet John Murray. And your story has been absolutely fascinating. And just an aside, and it's just an aside, way back, I have actually used and fired a Sterling submachine gun. And I can tell you they're very inaccurate. They're close quarter weapons. If you were targeting someone any more than about 25 feet away, there's a very good chance that there's going to be a scatter of bullets.
That's exactly what happened.
Yeah, I could imagine. No matter how good a shot you are.
It's interesting, Tom, that you should mention Lockerbie because we discovered when we were researching that there's a lot of overlap between what was going on at the times between the Libyans that we were looking into and the Libyans that were involved or reportedly involved in the Lockerbie incident. One of the most interesting things we discovered was that during the course of the search of the Libyan embassy in 1984, a number of weapons were left behind when the Libyans abandoned the embassy. Some pistols. One of the pistols, or it might have been two of the pistols, was traced to an armaments manufacturer in America where it had been acquired by a man who was known to be a CIA operative. And this CIA operative was arrested and prosecuted in America many years ago for illicit supply of weapons and materials to the Libyans on the black market. And he was incarcerated for 30 years. He was involved in training the Libyan intelligence service how to use things like transistor radios to create improvised explosive devices, supposedly of the kind used in the Lockerbie bombing. Throughout his period in American custody, I think he was in prison for about 30 years. He maintained his innocence, saying that all the time, everything he was doing, he was working for the CIA. He wasn't an independent who was working on the black market but trying to make a few money. He was actually working for the CIA. And of course, the CIA said, no, it's nothing. It's not true. About 10 or 15 years ago now, he actually managed to appoint a lawyer who had sufficient level of security clearance that this lawyer could gain access to CIA material, which under their disclosure rules, he was able to obtain, which demonstrated this chap had all along been working for the CIA. And as a result, he was able to appeal his sentence and he was released. And all that time, the CIA had been lying about the fact that he was not one of them. They'd hung him out to dry. And so this chap, we know And this weapon that had been sold to him in America had somehow managed to get to the Libyan embassy in London. So there had to be a connection between this chap who was providing the Libyan training and the Libyan embassy in London. Some skullduggery, as we describe it, going on in the background.
Tom's got a slogan that's followed us through Crime Time Inc. over the last few months since we launched, and it is that the truth is very often much stranger than fiction would ever be. And when we start talking about our security services, and it's something that we are going to be speaking about over the coming weeks and months, is undercover work and working in these places where the truth is very difficult to discern most of the time. Tom?
It's interesting you talk about that, because it doesn't surprise me at all that there were some key figures involved in the Libyan security service in 84 and in 88 and on through, because, of course, Gaddafi was paranoid about trust, and he only actually trusted his own tribe. And so you see the same names cutting through because they were the only people. And in actual fact, some of the people involved, or suspects in the Lockerbie bombing, were actually relatives, some distance removed, but relatives of Gaddafi himself.
Yeah, Gaddafi was from a particular Bedouin tribe called the Wafala, and a lot of these other people, they're from the same tribe.
It's a bit like a crime family.
Yes.
But it's going to draw a close there. The one thing I do want to reiterate, apart from your book, No Ordinary Day, which I'm going to be fascinated to get a hold of, the one thing that I want to reiterate is that when I first got in touch with you, I think it was through Twitter or whatever, I had it in the back of my mind that there might be some conspiracy theorist going on. There might be some. There's plenty of them out there that we could speak to. But when I spoke to you, I very quickly realised that everything you're saying to us here is going to be analysed very shortly under the forensic court. It's going to be in court. People, the evidence is going to be led. This is all real. This is all actual, documented and witnessed, and statements and all what you would expect. And the meta right behind that and getting this to the prosecution system.
The meta, the establishment isn't.
That's okay. Let's leave that for John.
John will explain to you he has had some incredible hurdles to overcome to get justice for Yvonne, and he's not done yet.
No, and we'll do everything we can here at Crime Time Inc. to support him in that and get the word out there, because it's the kind of thing that we should know about. Tom, anything to sum up with?
Just to say, it's been an absolute pleasure. I've followed this case for a long time. I've been interested in it for all of the reasons we've discussed. And tonight I've learned a lot. And it's a fantastic job you've done. And I will be going out and getting No Ordinary Day just as soon as. Very interesting. And congratulations on your tenacity. And you've kept going. It's an example to us all. So well done.
Have you heard the head of the anti-terrorist squad for UK, a chap called John Grieve?
Yeah, I know John Grieve. I've met him.
John Grieve, Professor John Grieve, came to the book launch in June. And having read the book, and he said that he was going to get, and he did, he gave us a quote for the jacket on the book. And he said it's a book that when he read, he said it will have pride of place in my library. He said, I have 20,000 books. He said, and I have a very small collection of books, which is on the bookshelf right by my desk. He said, that book is now right by my desk. He says, one of the best books I've ever read. He said, but, he said, the suits will never live it down when they discover it was written by a black rat.
The really bad news, Matt, is he told me exactly the same thing about my book.
It's a real compliment. So well done. I remember him very well, and a fine man he was. A very good police officer too. So I look forward to reading the book.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks very much for doing that.
It's been a real pleasure.
Next time on Crime Time Inc.
I thought someone had thrown a firework and Yvonne fell. I ran over to her, and then a few seconds later I heard the screams because other people had been shot. There were 2 gunmen. There were 12 or 13 Libyans shot and wounded, and we arrived at the hospital. I was shaking like a leaf. The doctor came in. He said, PC Murray, we're taking her to theatre now. But roughly an hour and a half later, again I'm still there on my own. The same doctor came back. He had the green gown on, there was some blood on it, and he was crying. And he said, so sorry, we lost her. The internal injuries were far worse than we thought. The bullet went through her elbow, through her arm, into her torso, through her spleen, through her internal organs. And he said there was just nothing we could do. I'm so sorry. And off he went.